Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Michael, and I'm from the Honest Youth Pastor. And tonight, we're going to be looking at the latest Julia Royce report on this live. Now, in case you're new here, this channel exists to help believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. And hopefully tonight, we're going to be able to do that by looking at every piece of this report and specifically the videos mentioned in it. So let's get to it. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the stream. Tonight, we are going to be looking at the latest report put out by the Royce Report. Now, in case you're just coming to the stream and you're like, what is the Royce Report? Why does this matter? Hopefully tonight, if you're not interested in this at all, you'll still get something out of it, because we're going to be kind of looking at biblical counseling, what that looks like as regards to how it's taught in some churches and how it's sort of approached in a variety of different ways, and how those ways are pretty controversial depending upon who you talk to and what churches you attend and what maybe even denominations you go to. Now, if you are sort of just catching up with the whole Royce Report, you've heard about it, you've seen it online a little bit, I actually have a playlist that I will link in the description after this live that covers all the videos I've done on it so far. There are 3 different videos I've done as I've kind of went through and talked about it. The very short story is just so you kind of catch up and you know what's going on, in case this is the first video you're watching and you don't want to watch like almost 2.5, 3 hours of content. John MacArthur is a pastor out in California. He runs, he's the lead pastor of Grace Community Church. And back in 2002, he excommunicated a lady by the name of Eileen Gray because she would not go back with and reconcile with her husband, which had abused their children and her. And it was later found out that her husband, which is named David, that he had not only abused the children physically, but he also abused the children sexually. And he is currently sentenced in California in prison system for, I think it's another 10 years. He was originally sentenced 20 years to life, and he was just denied parole, and I think he's in there for another 10 years essentially. Now, the idea is that Julie Royce put out that initial report. There's a bunch of documentation in there, and the videos I did were basically putting a timeline together to see kind of how these actually, like the events in which they occurred in order, because the original article wasn't incredibly helpful in outlining it that way. Long story short, she was kind of calling on John MacArthur to make a statement, to step down, to be held accountable for excommunicating Eileen, because she believes that Eileen was wrongfully excommunicated. And Eileen has since moved on. She doesn't obviously go to Grace Community Church anymore. But the Royce Report has put out a few things kind of revealing sort of the different practices of Grace Community Church. Grace Community Church up to this point has not released a statement, though there have been, not an official statement, there have been a variety of statements that essentially come out to the idea that they don't believe that David Gray actually committed the sexual abuse that he's in prison for, that he was wrongfully convicted of that, and that's why they are supporting his prison ministry now, and that's why they still excommunicated Eileen, his wife, because she did not reconcile with her husband after he had repented of the physical abuse in counseling. Now, this is kind of gets us to where we're at tonight as far as counseling, biblical counseling, what it looks like, because the Royce Report actually put out I believe it was yesterday or the day before, a playlist of let me put this up real quick, a playlist of different Master Seminary lectures on abuse and how to deal with counseling abuse victims. Now, that playlist is available in the link below, and you can watch through. This is what I would encourage you to do. I guess before we get too far into this video, we're almost 5 minutes into the live. This is what I would encourage you to do. I would encourage you to go, if you have the time, go watch through the first 3 counseling sessions. Now, it's going to take you a while. The first one's like 1 hour and 10 minutes. The second one's 1.5 hours, and the last one's nearly 2 hours. But those are going to give you the full context of the clips that you see on the Royce Report. And that's kind of what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to walk through those videos, because even if you don't care anything about the Royce Report, this will be interesting for you, I think, to sort of say, well, how do different churches conduct sort of counseling with with people that come in that are in abusive situations. Now, in particular to the situation we're looking at as far as the Royce report goes, Julie Royce rather didn't, I don't think, write this particular article that got posted, but it's posted on her site and she backs it up, which basically says that the head of counseling at John MacArthur's school says that wives should endure abuse like missionaries endure persecution. And we'll get to that point. There's two primary clips that she has posted on that report that also they're sort of called out. Now, there is one thing I want to get into before we get too far into it. Well, actually, I'll tell you what, we'll come back to that here in a minute. So, as we get into this, what I want to do for you, in case you don't have time to watch those videos, now, just so you know, this is going to be very informational. It's not flashy. There's not a lot going on in the background. This is very informational. If you can't watch those videos, I do want to sort of give you the 3,000-foot view of those first 3 counseling sessions that we see in that playlist. Okay, just so you kind of have an idea of what's going on, because the clips that are provided in the Royce report on this it doesn't do a lot to actually reveal what's actually happening within the teachings itself. It leaves a lot of context out. And here's the thing, I think it's important. And before we get into this, let me just state out front, there's a lot of things that Dr. John Street covers in his teaching that I don't think's great, but it's definitely not outside of biblical counseling as far as how counseling has been done in a variety of churches I know about. And we'll kind of walk through that and explain that a little bit. But it's presented within the report as if this is like just a terrible way of counseling. And the clips that are taken out and presented on the site give you a very short picture of a much longer session. And that's what I hope to show you here, not to defend Street in his teachings, but rather just to say, hey, with everything we look at, we need context for the situation, whether that be a sermon clip that people just blast on the internet and Twitter and just share. You don't know what the context of that sermon clip is, whether it be good or bad. You don't know what led up to that. Same thing with the news. You put out clips, you don't know the context of that situation. So it's very much left up to the story to either be, us to assume what the person was saying up to that point, or for the story to be painted for us for what that person was saying. And it just simply may not be the case. And what I want to show you here that I was really kind of surprised in, because I'm somebody, if you've watched any of the content, that's why we do the sermon reviews the way we do. I want you to see every aspect of it. So there's no way that I'm taking something that somebody says out of context. And I think that's incredibly important when we look at anything, especially a situation like this that is so heated, that is so polarizing, that is it's very easy to read ourselves and our bias into the situation and just ignore the context of what is being said. And it's very important, I think, as Christians, if we're believers, to say, I want to hear the full story before I make my call on this, because often we're very invested in it and we just simply don't come to it saying, I want to know the truth of the situation. So context is always key. Now, before we get into this, I do want to do one thing just so you kind of have an overview. The first part, the first session is basically defining what is abuse, who does it affect, and then how pastors are to engage that abuse. The second video covers the dynamics within pastoral counseling, and we'll look at that. And the third video is very heavy on God using abuse, but not necessarily like walking in and accepting abuse, but knowing that God uses it and then responding in godly ways to that abuse to win the abuser. I wrote that wrong, but it's to win the abuser to righteousness. And that part we're going to probably have to like really get into a little bit. So let me pull this back up so we can walk through it. Okay, so the first session is very much about what is abuse, who does it affect, and how to engage it. And you have to remember, these sessions that these videos are coming from are given to people that are either pastors or are going to be pastors in counseling sessions. It's very easy to assume or to read into, based upon what our maybe experiences with abuse or with the church, read onto what John is teaching here. But we have to understand that as pastor, if you're a pastor, you probably know this, like every single counseling session with a married couple, whether it involves abuse or not, is incredibly different. Every single one of them, because everybody you counsel is different. Every couple that comes to you is different. The severity of the abuse is going to be different, and all of these things have to be taken into account. So when he starts off the first session where he's talking to them, he does state out that the classes are like a jumping off point and they're not a total teaching on the matter. He says that a couple times. But the point is that I want you to understand that if you just watch the clips on Royce Report, you're going to they're not set up in a way that it's almost like, well, John Street is saying this is the way it is. But he starts off and he says, like, this is a jumping off point. Abuse and dealing with abuse is very sensitive, and it takes a great deal of care to do that. Again, variety of people, a variety of reactions, a variety of severity of abuse. Like, all of these things have to be taken into account. He says the primary focus of the courses, and he makes this so just so you have an understanding of sort of all of the courses that follow after the first session, if you choose to watch them. He states at the very beginning that all of these are focusing on physical abuse, not emotional. I put not physical or emotional, but he says they're all physical abuse. It's not focusing on like emotional or verbal abuse. And then he does say much of the work to fix abuse has been done. And this is something that was very surprising to me. And I think it would be surprising to you guys too. The first session, he comes right out and says that most of the fixing of abuse that's been done within the church has been done by women speaking up, because they're speaking up and correcting abusive men that have misused text on submission. I mean, he comes right out and says in the first video that he's like, yeah, it's, of course people have misused the text. Of course people have sinful men have used the text to lord it over their wives in an unbiblical way. And his point in saying this from the beginning is to say, like, there is a way to rightly view this, and there is a way to say, no, you're using the text in a way that's not helpful. And then he goes on and he's talking about how the counselor, as counselors are in the session, and this was also, I think, very helpful because the way that, again, I mean, I'm sure everybody's got a different perspective on this, but the way the Royce Report has really kind of wrote this out is that Grace Community Church teaches that emotion is bad and it's just the facts, and emotions lie and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things that he says in the opening is that you have to get as much information as possible, which of course, when you're counseling people, you want to do that. You want to listen well, and you want to understand that the person is coming in and they're viewing their situation of abuse through pretty emotional lenses, and you need to take that into account. Which again, I found surprising. I don't know if you guys would or not. He also talks about how, and this is the part that a lot of people will probably disagree with. This seems to be the rub, as I mentioned in my previous videos, that he does talk about that every Christian should be part of a local church community that works within the guidelines of Scripture and practices church discipline. This seems to be a big deal, and I hope to make a video eventually soon on it about church discipline and how church discipline is biblical and how it should be done and how it can be done correctly and in not an abusive way. And one of the things that he flat out states that this is sort of, if you're a believer, and I know a lot of people are going to have issue with this, but in Scripture, it's pretty clear that we are supposed to be a part of a local community of believers underneath elder shepherds that are there for our care, for our guidance, and we're supposed to look to them as an example of who to follow and kind of what we should be doing. And as that relationship works out, they are over us to direct us, and there is a church disciplinary action that should happen if a Christian steps out of line to what Scripture says. And so what John Street sets up at the very beginning of the sessions is saying that if you're a believer, you should be a part of a local body that exercises church discipline within scriptural guidelines, because, and this is why he says this, because if there is abuse within a Christian relationship, that should put an end to it right away. Because what happens is if the elders come and say you are working outside of the scriptural definition of what your relationship with your wife or what your husband should be, when you have church discipline and church teaching that's watching over and caring for the flock, you hypothetically, if it's a healthy body and is doing what it should be doing, the abuse within Christian relationships should be kind of nipped in the bud right away. And so he very much states from the first session that like every Christian should be in a church that exercises church discipline within scriptural guidelines. And if you're not, it's going to be dangerous and damaging to you because there's not the guidelines set up there that God has gifted us to keep the believers safe and to keep us, iron sharpening iron in that sort of manner. So then he also works with the marital matrix of the home. And this is helpful, especially even if, again, even if you could care less about the Royce report thing, this is very helpful because he says a Christian counselor engages with couples in this way. And this is true. This is the same way that premarital counseling works as well as obviously marital counseling with abuse, is that you have to figure out, is it a Christian husband? Is it a non-Christian husband? Is it a Christian wife? Is it a non-Christian wife? And the idea is that there are different authorities over these people depending on if they declare to be a Christian or not. So if you're a believer, you should be in a church that has elders that exercise church discipline, that are there to act as an example, to guide you, to teach you, to hold you accountable. And when that's true, if it's a Christian husband and a Christian wife, you have two forms of authority over you. Firstly, the church authority, which should be able to take care of all of these things that come up before they get out of hand and call you to repentance and hold you accountable for that. And then you also have the civil authority. So the government, the police, those sorts of things. If they need to get involved, they can. And then, of course, there's the non-Christian husband and the non-Christian wife. And if they're a non-Christian husband or a non-Christian wife, they're not under church authority. They're not going to listen anyway. They don't believe the Bible. They don't believe in Jesus. They could care less about what the church says about things. And he says, like, there's a dynamic there that he will explore in the second video that is actually really helpful in regards to understanding sort of how this Christian counseling happens and why it's important to understand that there is a different dynamic at play when there is a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse. Now, the second session, he really, really gets into this. The majority of the video works through the 4 categories, addressing how each of the counseling sessions would differ based on who was the believer and who wasn't. And he puts a ton of emphasis in this section on the goal of counseling being the reconciliation of the couple. Now, 2 things here. One, if you've been following the Royce report and the Gray situation, right? Over and over again, the elders were encouraging Eileen to reconcile with David. And I know there's a lot of things going on there that are at play. One of the things that are at play there is that they were wanting her to, the Royce report would say they were trying to get her to get back with her abusive husband. However, within the counseling sessions, David admits to the abuse and apparently repents of that abuse. And the idea is, as they've monitored him with her and the kids, you'll see in the first or second video I made that they've determined that the abuse, they don't feel like he is a danger to the kids or her, and they encourage her to reconcile with him, with, of course, the stipulation being that they are going to be checking in on, and they are still going to be exercising church discipline over him if he does it again. Now, again, it's important to note, at this point, they don't know about the sexual abuse that he would later get convicted of. Also, real quick, I see there's some questions coming in. We will get to those at the very end. So one of the things that we do have in this section, though, is that there's a heavy emphasis, and we see this when we look at the Gray case, right? There's a heavy emphasis from John's teaching that the goal is reconciliation. That is the goal. So whenever, according to Grace Community Church, they're entering into a counseling session, the ultimate goal, the goal that overrides everything else that they're doing, the one focus they have, like the finish line, is that the couple would be reconciled and that they would come back together. Now, of course, that might take some time. That may entail a lot of different things, but the idea is that they would work toward reconciliation if possible. So at the 1 hour and 25-minute mark is where the first clip that's included in the Royce report actually comes in. And I do want to say that this is the clip that talks about how the wife should endure abuse like a missionary endures abuse. I have to say that I don't like the example. I think the example is really sloppy. I don't know if he had it written down or if he just kind of came up with it off the top of his head, but it is pretty sloppy because the example falls apart pretty quick. Missionaries choose to be in a country they know is dangerous, whereas a wife oftentimes would not choose to be in an abusive situation. With that being said, within the context of the total teaching in the second video, which again, I would encourage you to watch every one of these videos if you have the time. Do not take my word for it. I would encourage you to watch them so that you hear what he says all the way through. Um, but the idea is that he wants them to pursue counseling in a biblically accurate way, one that encourages the abused to draw closer to God in troubled times. And I feel like that's the, even though it's a really sloppy example, if you hear the whole video within context, the best way, again, even with the example being terrible, I think what he's trying to get at is the idea here that, like, in the situations we're in, that oftentimes we know, it could go sideways anytime. That the point is that we are, we take those times and we use them and say, how can we grow closer to God in these moments while also being responsible about the places we're at? And he does get to that, and I want to make sure that we get to that. So, just so you know a little bit more about the context, that point about being like missionaries, being in that abuse is actually a response to the fourth point that he's talking about. He's trying to make distinctions between biblical counseling and what he would consider integrationalist counseling. So the first point that he's saying is that integrationalist counseling, their goal is to stop the hurt, their goal is to stop the harm, their goal is in their counseling is no different between Christians and non-Christians. They act like everybody's the same. And then their goal of the counseling is only for the health of the abused. And that was one of the things in the clip, that he says that their goal is only for the health of the abused. What he doesn't seem to be saying, if you watch the whole thing in context, isn't that the pastor shouldn't be concerned about the health of the abused, but rather also walking the person that's going through the abuse through the understanding that God may be using this abuse to grow them closer to himself. Now, again, one of the things I didn't mention that I forgot about, but I'm glad I remembered it now, was when he was going through that dynamic of Christian husband, non-Christian, Christian wife, non-Christian wife. One of the things he does mention is that when he's counseling a non-Christian individual that clearly doesn't believe the Bible, does not care about the dictates of God, his goal for them is to tell them that, yeah, they can change their habits, but that's not the core root of the problem. The core root of the problem is sin. They don't know Jesus. They are pursuing their own passions, and pursuing their own passions will ultimately lead them in a sinful direction that is going to end in sinful means. So he does note that when he's talking to non-believers, he'll mention that, yeah, you can, like, you can change your behavior, you can, modify your behavior, but at the end of the day, you're not dealing with the root of the problem, because the root of the problem is sin. So for example, he's not going to tell a non-Christian wife that's in abuse that this is for God's glory and you can go closer to God in this moment. Rather, he's going to point them to Jesus. And then in a Christian situation, whether it be a husband being abused or a wife being abused, he of course is going to care for their health in that situation. But he also alludes that there's, again, a bigger goal here, which is that the ultimate goal is restoration, but also that this moment isn't a wasted moment. This moment is actually a moment, as terrible as it is, and as much as we're going to try to fix it, it is a moment that God could use to draw you closer to him. And I just think that the clip that was included in the Royce report doesn't capture that, mainly because he uses a terrible illustration, and I think that just ruins the whole thing. I think the missionary example was bad. But anyway, I just want to get that across, and the reason I'm confident that that's what he's talking about is because when we move on to the third session, the entire third session is talking about how God uses abuse, though we shouldn't just be in abuse to be in abuse, but it's how we respond to that abuse that is actually the beneficial thing that may draw those that are far from God, including the abuser, to Jesus. So he says that God often uses afflictions as ways to grow believers and will use terrible sin and situations to do that. He uses Joseph as an example, right? So Joseph is sold by his brothers. He just goes through terrible situations, but eventually, that famous line that we all know, where Joseph says to his brothers, "What you meant for evil, God used for good." And that's one of the examples that John uses when he's talking about walking people through abuse that are believers. He says that you shouldn't just accept the fact that you're in abuse and be okay with that. Being abused for the sake of being abused isn't godly. It's how you react to that abuse that then is a demonstration of your relationships to God, and then how you parse through terrible situations that do happen to you. Now, with that being said, I do want to make one note here. There was a tweet that was going around today that was part of the third video. This right here, this tweet was up, and it's at the beginning of the third session. John Street is teaching on, again, dealing with situations and how to react, to the terrible situations that do happen to you as a believer. And he mentions a story called Glenda's story. And the tweet here, I'm just going to read the tweet so you kind of get the context of what's going on. John Street, the tweet says this: John Street teaching biblical counseling, quote, "The stepfather ended up sleeping with Glenda from the time she was 4 years of age. And because there was no sexual fulfillment with the mother, the stepfather ended up finding sexual satisfaction with the young girl for several years." Now, John here seems to be, and I don't know, I didn't buy the book, but he seems to be telling the story in the way that Glenda tells it in her story, in which she talks about God showing her that the terrible situation she endured, that being one of them, is the situation that God used to bring him to himself, or her to himself, and show her grace and mercy. And she found peace in the Lord, and wasn't defined by the terrible situations that happened to her in her childhood. Now, for whatever reason, people assume that what John is saying in this tweet or in this clip is condoning what the stepfather did. Again, guys, don't take my word for it. Go watch the beginning of the third session. It's very easy to see what John is saying is he's using Glenda's story as sort of a modern example of like Joseph's story, where he says, look, yeah, this terrible thing happened to you. The unfortunate truth is you can't change what happened to you, but you can determine how you react to that situation, either in a godly way or an ungodly way. You can't change what happened. It was terrible. It was brutal. And I mean, even if you watch session 1 and 2, you're going to know that John Street is not teaching that this was an okay thing that the stepfather did. I think that is a gross misrepresentation of that clip, especially if you watch through the first 3 sessions. But what he is doing is he's saying, hey, there's a modern day example here of a believer that went through a terrible situation that is now, because of God's grace and mercy, seeing her life through the lens of God's grace and mercy, and is using a terrible situation for good. So I just want to bring that out real quick, because that was something that comes up in that third session, and it's an example of what he's trying to point out here. So he is careful to point out suffering just for suffering's sake isn't Christian and isn't helpful to the believer's life. He uses the example that a Christian wife isn't going to be abused and go back and ask to be abused more. It's not godly to stay in that situation. Rather, it's how you interact with that situation that that it actually determines, like, are you reacting in a holy way or a non-holy way in those situations. And the goal of godly counseling, ultimately, John says, is to bring reconciliation between the believer and God, especially if there's abuse and there's something that needs to be repented of there, and there's something that needs to be dealt with within counseling as well as church discipline. But it is also, the goal is to bring the people back together. And this seems to be, and I can see where a lot of people would have issue with this, because what you're really talking about at its core is reconciling the abuser with the abused. And I think in our modern day society, we have a really hard time with that, because we go, yeah, that shouldn't happen. They should be as far away from each other as possible. What John Street, though, is teaching here is, again, what I would consider a very biblical view of saying, look, God can redeem the hearts of the abused and the abuser. That the abuser isn't so far from grace that they can't be redeemed and forgiven and changed. I think we have this mentality that if somebody abuses someone, they are like they're marked as an abuser forever. Now, again, yes, we need to verify the fruit of that salvation if they claim salvation. There needs to be obviously checks and balances put in place to ensure that they're not just saying that to say that. But I think if, as Christians, declaring that God can literally change people from one way to another, like when we're declaring that, we're saying that there are radical changes that can happen in the hearts and minds of individuals, and we really believe that. And so one of the things that John is talking about is that, like, the way that the abuser or the abused reacts to the abuser, assuming again that this is a Christian person being abused, is that the way we react in a godly way may very well be used by God to soften that person's heart and bring them to Jesus. Now he uses First Peter chapter 2 and 3 to kind of walk through that a little bit. In fact, if you start at the 34-minute mark in session 3 and go through minute mark 58, he walks through there and sort of, I wouldn't say he exegetically breaks it down really detailed, but he does work through that passage, kind of explaining what that would look like, not only within that culture, but how that would translate to now. And I thought that was helpful. I might have missed something. If I did, leave it in the comment section. But I thought he did a fairly good job in that section of making his point. Then he gets to the end and he makes the statement that really, he states that there's two safety nets that should be in place for anyone that's abused, non-Christian or Christian. That the church should be there. Now, if it's a Christian individual, the church should be there to not only protect them because they're our family, but to make sure that church discipline and church teaching and repentance is called for. And then obviously the government and civil authority, if necessary, is called in to take care of situations when it needs to be taken care of. One of the statements made in the Roy's report is that John states that you shouldn't call the police and you should use your discretion when doing so. And that oftentimes when the police are called, they take it out of the hands of the biblical counselors. That is true. He does say all of those things, but he also mentions a number of times. I know he mentions it once in session 1, and then he mentions it here in session 3, that if needed, if it's a situation where it's undoubtedly a time where you need to call the civil authorities in to exercise their authority, you do so. So I think to say that John just flat out says you don't call the authorities is incorrect, because he mentions a couple times that you should actually do that. And I think that's, again, going back to what I said at the beginning. As a Christian counselor, as a pastor, one of the things you should do was that when you have to address, like in session 1, you need to say, okay, what is the situation? Is this a believer? Is this not a believer? Is this a situation where the abuse is pretty high? Did one of the people request for the civil authorities to be called in? Clearly, if that's the case, we need to do that. So it's one of those things where we need to address it on a situational basis, because every situation is different. I do see there's some comments coming in. We'll get to those at the end if there's any questions there. So, and then at the end, minute mark, 1 hour and 25 minutes is where the second clip that's in the Royce report actually comes in to the question. Now, the interesting thing is, and again, I don't, as I've stated in every one of my videos on these whole Royce report situations, I don't want to assume any like deliberate ill will that like the Royce report is deliberately trying to spin a story a certain way. I don't want to assume that. There have definitely been times when I've been looking into this that I go, it sort of seems like they're trying. I don't want to assume that, but they do cut the clip off before he states that the church and civil authorities should be brought into the picture when necessary. So he does state that, yeah, there are times when abuse does happen and we don't want that to happen. And what we need to do is, in those situations, if we do feel like it's very necessary, that we do bring the civil authorities in. So let's go ahead. That was the last one there. Let's take that down. Let's see if there's any questions over here real quick, and then we will get we'll get into, here's the first question. When does pastoral counseling need to extend to mental health professional counseling therapy? Do you know if Grace Community Church also refers people to mental health professionals when needed? I have no idea the inner workings of Grace Community Church. I mean, on the only thing I know is what has been given in the Royce report, as far as links, as far as how they do things. I will say this: the playlist, at least the first 3 sessions that I watched through, it does seem that they were fairly consistent in exercising what John Sweet taught. They seem like they were fairly consistent in exercising those principles in the Gray case, in regards of seeking reconciliation, in regards to that being the ultimate goal. They do seem to at least stay consistent with what they're teaching. My guess, though, just by I don't want to. I don't know. My guess would be they probably try to prevent as much as possible sending people outside of the church. I could be wrong on that, but it seems like that is sort of the goal, is to keep it in the church as much as possible. I don't think it's for a nefarious reason. I just think they view the scriptures as the first mode of Christian like discipline should be done by the church, and then if necessary, in extreme circumstances, then you bring out civil, like outside authorities. So my guess would be they wouldn't actually um, refer people to mental health professionals, but I could be wrong. But your first question, when does pastoral counseling need to be extended? I think that is a case by case basis. There have been people that I've had to refer before to, or not like professionally refer, but like say, hey, you need to go to a professional here, especially in like situations where they were self-harming. Like, you need to go, here's a number, here's a place, you need to go talk to these people. This is outside of like my sphere of understanding. Now, of course, in those situations, you point them to Jesus, you point them to peace in Christ. You pray with them, you follow up with them. But I do think there's times where pastoral counseling, there does need to be a, hey, I'm not equipped in this area, this person over here is, and then refer them, if possible, to a Christian, a mental health professional that is a believer, that is then going to sort of work through that with them in a Christian way. I think as pastors, we do need to be careful to do that. If we're just sending our members to psychologists and mental health professionals that don't have the lenses of the gospel on, I don't know if that's incredibly helpful. But it is something obviously that you kind of have to fill out person by person. Okay, next question. Michael, are you familiar with ACBC? I am, and I was taught that. You're right that these clips weren't made in a vacuum. The context is not just the seminars, but also the greater context of ACBC. I can't say that I know what ACBC is. I'd have to look that up. The idea is that, yeah, so these clips and how counseling is done, again, is incredibly important. One of the things that I think is so divisive with this whole thing, right, is that what seems to be the most three divisive things is church discipline and how it's performed. Because there are people that would look at this situation with David and Eileen and say, yes, this was done in a proper way. And then there's going to be people on the totally other side of that that say, no, this was done in an incorrect way. And I think we just really have, again, I think most of this depends on where you grew up, the denomination you came from, if you were in a church that even practiced discipline. That's one of the things. The second thing that seems to be the real sticking point, especially with this counseling part, is like, do you seek for reconciliation? Like, is that the ultimate goal, or is that a secondary goal in the situation? And with the Master Seminary making it like the ultimate goal, it seems like, and I could be reading the room wrong here, but it seems like people are assuming that what they're saying is that they don't care about the health or the well-being of the person, when I think they do. They seem to communicate that within the fully watched out clips. Their goal, though, is that's lower on there. They're much more concerned about the overall reconciliation of the total person within those moments. And then the last thing that seems to be very polarizing is really, it's a theological thing. Like, does God use these moments to teach the individuals how to be closer to him, how to trust more in him. These terrible situations, as terrible as they are. So, like with the story of, oh, what was the name? What was the name there? Glinda's. Like with Glinda's story, like, does God use even the most terrible of situations, like Glinda's story was, in a redemptive way, so that we can see that like God is a God that can work in the messiest of circumstances, and does Christian counseling, I think this is sort of, again, the third kind of divisive thing in all this, does Christian counseling work to really bring that to the surface, that yes, these are terrible situations, yes, what you're going through is bad, and then walking with the person through that, not only helping them deal with this reconciliation, but also pointing them to Jesus in that this terrible thing, it could be used, and probably is being used for your good, even though you don't see it, and being very careful with that. One of the things, and I'll end with this. One of the things that I think is missed oftentimes, especially when we're dealing with situations like this, is that we jump to conclusions and then we downplay the complexity. When you're dealing with individuals that are emotionally entangled in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different levels of abuse, in situations that they may, like, the particulars of it, they may not be telling you. Like, there's a lot to do with that you have to work through, that takes a lot of time. And what happens, because of the internet and because of how easy things are shared, what often happens is that we jump to conclusions and say, well, this is how I would do it. And most of the time, people that do this don't have never been in a counseling situation. And it's one of those things where, um, the situation is very much being downplayed, and the complexity of the situation is being downplayed greatly, to the point that, we're not really taking time to think through it and to say, okay, this is a very complex thing, this is a very difficult thing. And oftentimes, honestly, this is why some pastors and some churches simply don't do church discipline, because it is messy, it does take time, and there's a lot entailed and wrapped up in it. And oftentimes, on the other side, someone's going to be very upset with how it came out, and then you're going to be dealing with a very much smaller situation, but a situation similar to kind of what the Royce report has brought out in regards to Eileen being excommunicated and everybody kind of have an opinion about that. Um, so anyway, what we got? We got a little bit of time. Yeah. So we got two more questions to come in. Let me look at these real quick, because we're under an hour. It's all good. So what do you think about the theories of people in the Bible having mental illness? David being bipolar, Elijah having depression. Um, well, I think what you're saying here is true in the regards to that there are theories, right? There is absolutely no way to know at all, if that's accurate. Now, because that's not the point, right? That's not the point of the text. The point of the text isn't to tell us about the most intricate things of their life. But what we do see, and what the story of the Bible is overall, is that God is sufficient and God is working in and through his people. So, for example, when we talk about David, right, we see David in a variety of different emotional states, and God has been gracious enough to give us his word with all of that messiness in it, right? All of the humanity packed in there of David's highest highs and David's lowest lows. And it's really a gift to us, whether David was bipolar or not. It's a gift to us as believers to say, this is the emotional range of humanity. And even in that emotional range, we can see how we can call out to God, whether it be the greatest day or the worst, and take hope and comfort in him. Because again, ultimately, the scriptures are showing us how our creator God, the Father that created all things, interacts with us as his creation, even in the messiness of, like, pretty messy David's. I mean, just look at David's situation. Even in David's mess, how God interacts with us. And the beautiful part of it redeems us in the deepest, darkest sin. And again, I think that calls back to what we were talking about earlier. is that like there is redemption for everyone. That is the message of the believer, is that Jesus can redeem anyone, and we should seek for that redemption in people, call them to that in Jesus Christ. Another question here: do you think that Grace Community Church should accept or attempt to reconcile with Eileen Gray in light of what they know now? Well, here's the kind of the issue with that. As far as I can tell, Grace Community Church doesn't believe that David did the things that David was convicted for. So in their understanding of biblical counseling, as sort of outlined within those 3 sessions we talked about, she refused to reconcile with her husband. And in so doing, I mean, one of the things that she did, like, for example, if you look at my timeline video, she moved away, and then David files for divorce. And if you listen to the first 3 sessions of the counseling sessions, within their teaching, at least, what they would say is Eileen moving away is gives David license to divorce her, because she has clearly said, I do not want to reconcile, which they would not only take as her not wanting to reconcile, but her maybe not even being a believer, because she's not seeking reconciliation with David, even though he repented. Now, there's the whole mess there, right? Of what a lot of people are upset about is that they don't think David did it, and David was convicted of it. So there's that. That's out of all of the situations that makes this really messy. It's that conviction that they don't seem to have. They seem to think that he was wrongly convicted, and therefore they don't see a reason to apologize or reconcile to her, because they don't think he did anything wrong. They think she's the one that refused to reconcile, and therefore they did the right thing in their eyes. So one last thing here. ACBC is Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. It's a whole philosophy of Street and the Master's University. It's a crucial point in this. Gotcha. So it's one of those things. Probably, apparently, should have looked into that a little bit more. But no, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I've been introduced to that and I just don't remember the acronym. That's a possibility. I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I'm not sure. So last comment: I know people who say they'd rather be counseled by ACDC than ACBC. I'm gonna have to look into it, because honestly, I very well may have been introduced to it and just don't recognize the acronym or not. But I can't speak to it because I don't. I just honestly don't. I don't know anything about it. So anyway, guys, hopefully this was familiar. Again, links are going to be in the description below for the Roy's Report, for the playlist for those videos, which again, guys, I would encourage you to watch everything we look at. I would encourage you, if there isn't the ability to view or listen to the full context, I would definitely encourage all the time for that to be done. I know we all have limited time, but if we're going to have a voice and we're going to have an opinion about it and we're going to make statements about it, we need to at least be informed about it. So those links are down there in the description. The book link for Glenda's stories down there for no other reason, just to provide it and say, look, like, this is what he was referring to when he was talking about it, just to have that there. And then I will also put down there the link for the playlist for all of the videos, in case you are interested in catching up on everything as far as the Roy's Report goes. I tried to, in those videos, as hopefully I did in this video too, I don't know, I tried to be as unbiased as possible in those videos and every of these videos I've done. The idea is just to give you the timeline of kind of what happened. So if you're interested, that'll be down there too. Guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for the questions. Love doing these, and I'll see you later. You guys have a wonderful night.